Jake McAllister had spent the better part of his 34 years living alone on the vast, unforgiving ranch that had been in his family for generations. The Wyoming plains stretched endlessly in every direction, with the mountains looming. In the distance, their jagged peaks cutting through the horizon like the very bones of the earth. He had inherited this piece of land from his father, a man who had raised him to work hard, to never complain, and to never seek anything beyond the work that came with the land. His mother, a sweet, soft-spoken woman, had died when he was young, leaving Jake and his father to carry on alone. The years of his childhood had been spent in the company of cattle, horses, and the long, solitary stretches of land that seemed to echo with the weight of history. By the time he reached adulthood, Jake had become more than just a cowboy. He had become a part of the land itself. He knew every inch of his ranch, every path that wound through the hills, and every weathered fence post that had been erected. Long before his time, the smell of the earth, the cry of the hawks overhead, and the braying of the cattle were the sounds he had grown up with, the sounds that had shaped his life. And yet, despite the land's beauty, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. For all the endless open space, for all the quiet serenity that came with life on a ranch, Jake was painfully aware of the emptiness that stretched within him. His father had always told him that a man's work was his most important companion, that the land would always be there to provide for him. But as Jake grew older, he realized that the land couldn't offer what his heart truly needed. The loneliness had settled in over the years, a constant companion that was both familiar and suffocating. The long evenings spent by the fire, the cold nights beneath the stars, all of it had started to feel like a prison. There was a part of him, deep inside, that longed for something more. He longed for companionship, for someone to share the weight of the days, the joys, and the hardships. He dreamed of someone to sit beside him on those cold nights, someone to laugh with, to share the quiet moments, and to build a life together. But the years passed, and the people in his small town seemed to live lives far removed from the quiet, rugged existence he had chosen. Women from the nearby towns, those he had briefly crossed paths with, had lives of their own, lives filled with laughter, warmth, and families of their own. Jake had never found a woman who seemed to fit into the life he had made for himself. The world he inhabited was too rough, too raw, for delicate things like love to take root. The loneliness had begun to gnaw at him, more so as the seasons changed and the chill of winter began to set in. The long days of working the ranch were all-consuming, but when the work was done, when the cows were fed, the fences mended, and the horses were seen to, Jake would sit alone in the quiet cabin his father had built so many years ago. It was a small, simple house, with wooden beams that creaked when the wind blew, a fireplace that flickered with the warmth of his solitude, and walls adorned with mementos of his father's life. There were no pictures of a wife or children, no family photos, no reminders of the love that Jake had never known. The emptiness of the cabin seemed to mock him in the silence, as if it knew that he was still yearning for something, for someone. It was during these long, empty nights that Jake found himself thinking of the idea that had never quite left his mind. What if he were to find a mail-order bride? It seemed like a strange idea at first, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the only logical solution. He had heard of such things, of men who had sought out wives through agencies, women who were willing to leave their own lives behind and start anew with someone who had a life to offer. Jake didn't know what he was looking for exactly, but He knew that he was ready for a change. He didn't want to spend his life on the ranch, working alone, with only the wind and the cattle for company. He wanted a partner, someone who could understand the work, who could appreciate the land, and who would make his house feel like a home. The idea of a mail-order bride had never seemed like a possibility, but as the winter months closed in and the days grew shorter, Jake found himself at a crossroads. He had done everything the way his father had taught him, but in doing so, he had built a life that was as cold and empty as the land surrounding him. Maybe it was time to take a leap, to open his heart to someone, even if it meant stepping into unknown territory. So, with a sense of quiet determination, Jake sat down one evening at the small, worn desk in his cabin and began to fill out the application form that would change his life. He had no real expectations, no illusions that this would be an easy fix for the emptiness inside him. But as he filled out the form, describing his ranch, his life, and his hopes for the future, he couldn't help but feel a spark of hope, a quiet optimism that had been absent from his heart for years. He sent the application off and waited, unsure of what to expect, but silently wishing for the chance to change his life, to find the person who could bring warmth to the cold nights and light to the dark days. When the reply finally came, it was more than he had expected. The agency had found a match. A woman named Eliza who had recently lost her family and was looking to start fresh in the West. The letter described her as kind-hearted, gentle, and eager to build a life with someone who appreciated hard work and loyalty. She seemed to be the kind of woman Jake had hoped for, the kind of person who could understand the demands of a ranch and the quiet satisfaction of a simple life. There was a photograph included, and as Jake stared at the image of Eliza, his heart quickened. She was beautiful, with dark hair and a smile that seemed to promise warmth and understanding. For the first time in years, Jake felt a glimmer of hope, and he knew, with certainty, that he had made the right choice. As the days passed after Jake had sent the letter, his thoughts were often consumed by Eliza, the woman he had never met but had already begun to imagine in his life. Each morning, he would walk to the mailbox with a mixture of anticipation and doubt, his eyes scanning the horizon as if hoping for some sign that she was on her way. But the waiting was excruciating. It felt like a lifetime between letters, and as the months went by, Jake found himself growing restless. He had never been good at waiting. Patience was something his father had taught him was a virtue, but it was a virtue that Jake had never fully embraced. He was accustomed to working, to moving from one task to the next, always busy with something to do. But this waiting, this uncertainty about what was to come, gnawed at him in ways he hadn't anticipated. And yet, despite the frustration that simmered beneath his otherwise calm demeanor, there was something undeniable about the idea of Eliza. The letters had been full of promises of a new beginning, of a woman eager to escape her own past and build a future with him. He had found a glimmer of hope in her words, something that made him believe this could be his second chance at happiness. It wasn't just about companionship, it was about the possibility of a life shared, of waking up each day to someone who understood the solitude of the ranch and the promise of a life built through hard work and dedication. It was the kind of life that Jake had never imagined could include someone else. But now, with Eliza's letters in his hands, he found himself dreaming of a future that had room for love. The day the stagecoach finally arrived was a day Jake would never forget. His heart raced with excitement and fear as the rickety coach rolled up to the small stop in front of his ranch house. He had dressed in his finest clothes, though they were still worn from years of hard work. He had made an effort to clean himself up, to look presentable, even though he knew he wasn't one for fancy things. He wasn't sure what Eliza would expect, but he wanted to at least make the right impression. His boots scuffed against the gravel as he approached the stagecoach, the clatter of the wheels on the dirt road growing louder in his ears. His eyes scanned the small crowd of passengers. As they disembarked, each one a stranger, their faces unfamiliar. He was looking for the woman who had captured his attention with her letters, who had already become a part of his thoughts, his dreams. He held his breath as the last passenger stepped down, a woman with dark hair and a nervous expression. But as she looked up and their eyes met, Jake's heart skipped a beat, and confusion immediately replaced the excitement he had been feeling. This wasn't Eliza, the woman standing before him, her hands gripping the strap of her suitcase with unease, wasn't the woman he had come to expect. She was beautiful, yes, but there was something distinctly different about her. Her features weren't quite what he had pictured, and the warmth he had imagined in her smile was replaced by a hesitant, almost apologetic look. Jake felt a strange sense of unease flood through him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with the Eliza he had written to. She stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with the awkward silence that had fallen between them. "I'm sorry," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I think there's been a mistake. I'm Sarah, not Eliza." Jake stood frozen, unsure of what to say. His first instinct was to apologize and send her back to wherever she had come from, to fix the mistake and go on with his life as he had planned. But there was something in Sarah's eyes, something that told him that she wasn't here by choice, that she was just as confused by the situation as he was. He took a deep breath, trying to regain some composure. "Well, he began, his voice roughed with uncertainty. "I suppose we should sort this out." He cleared his throat and offered his hand to her, though the gesture felt awkward in the face of their shared confusion. "Jake McAllister? It's nice to meet you, Sarah." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with relief and something else he couldn't quite place. She didn't hesitate before reaching out and shaking his hand. "Thank you," she whispered, as though she hadn't expected him to be so kind. For a moment, neither of them knew what to say, both of them trapped in the confusion of this unexpected meeting. Jake had come here with the expectation that he would meet the woman who would change his life. But instead, he was standing face to face with a stranger who had no idea how she had ended up in this situation. As Sarah shifted her weight, still holding her suitcase in front of her, Jake tried to process the whirlwind of emotions that fluttered him. There was disappointment, confusion, but there was also a strange sense of curiosity. He had never expected this. He had never imagined that the woman he had corresponded with, the woman who had taken root in his heart with every letter, would not be the one who arrived. Over the following days, Jake tried to wrap his mind around the unexpected turn his life had taken. Sarah's presence in his home was a constant reminder that nothing in life ever went according to plan. He had expected Eliza to arrive a woman who had been carefully chosen for him by an AGC, and instead, he had found himself with Sarah, a woman he had never heard of, someone who had clearly been sent by mistake. At first, he had been unsure of what to do. The last thing he wanted was to be stuck in an awkward situation with a stranger, especially one who wasn't even supposed to be there. He had considered sending her back, arranging for her to return to the agency, but something held him back. There was a rawness to Sarah, a quiet vulnerability that tugged at him. She wasn't the woman he had expected, but in the short time she had been there, Jake began to see that there was something more to her than just an unfortunate mix-up. She wasn't Eliza, but she was something else, entirely something he hadn't expected, something that stirred a feeling inside him he couldn't quite explain. The days turned into weeks, and Sarah, though still obviously out of place, began to find her footing in the rhythm of ranch life. She had shown up unannounced, her life upended by a mistake she had no control over, yet she was quick to adapt, to try and make the best of her situation. She woke early every morning to help Jake with the chores, learning quickly how to care for the animals and managed the little tasks around the ranch that Jake had done for years. Despite the odd start to their acquaintance, Sarah had a natural way with the land. She was quiet but observant, always asking questions, and even though it was clear she was out of her element, there was an undeniable strength about her. Jake had expected someone who might be delicate or frightened by the hard, physical work of life on a ranch. But Sarah was different. She was more resilient than that. He watched, amazed, as she effortlessly took on tasks, from mucking out the stables to helping him repair the fences. There was no hesitation in her, no sign of the fear or discomfort he had expected. As she worked alongside him, something shifted inside Jake. What had begun as an awkward arrangement now seemed to be taking on a new form, a form that neither of them had planned for, but that felt strangely right. Jake found himself thinking about Sarah more and more, his curiosity growing with each passing day. She was not the woman he had been expecting, but she was real, genuine in a way that surprised him. She didn't carry herself with the airs of someone who had come from a life of luxury or city living. She was raw, like the land itself, and she didn't try to hide it. She was honest about her past, about the pain she had endured in losing her family, and how she had been searching for something new, something better in the West. As Sarah spoke about her past, her life before arriving at his ranch, Jake found himself drawn in by her story. She had come to the West to escape the memories of her former life, but she didn't dwell on the sorrow. Instead, she spoke of a quiet hope, a desire to find peace, to build a future, and to leave behind the remnants of her past. Jake was no stranger to loss, but Sarah's strength in the face of her struggles was something that touched him deeply. In some ways, he saw her as a mirror of himself, both of them carrying the weight of past disappointments, yet continuing to move forward, inch by inch, with a quiet determination that made them both stronger. At night, after a long day of work, they would sit together in the small cabin, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. The awkwardness from the first day was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding that had formed between them. They didn't need to talk constantly. The silence, which had once felt heavy and uncomfortable, now felt like a comfortable companion. Sometimes, Sarah would share stories of her childhood, of the bustling city life she had left behind, and other times, Jake would speak of the ranch, his family's legacy, and the life he had known for so long. They didn't discuss Eliza. It was never mentioned between them. But there was a mutual understanding that this life, this unexpected pairing, was the reality they were now facing. With each passing day, Jake's feelings for Sarah began to change. It wasn't love, at least not yet, but it was something real, something tangible, a connection formed not out of expectation or necessity, but from two people learning to navigate life together, finding in one another a sense of solace. and belonging that they hadn't known they were missing. Jake had thought that a mail-order bride would be the solution to his loneliness, but in Sarah found something far more unexpected and far more profound. She was not the woman he had imagined, but as the days went by, he began to see that. Perhaps fate had brought her to him for a reason. It wasn't long before Sarah began to feel the pull of the land as well. She had arrived on the ranch with little more than the clothes on her back and the hope of starting over. But as time passed, she found herself falling in love with the land, with the rhythm of ranch life that had once felt foreign to her. There was a simplicity to it that brought a sense of peace she hadn't expected. The sunsets that painted the sky in fiery oranges and pinks, the way the morning dew settled on the grass, the quiet hum of nature that filled the air at all, felt like a new beginning for her, one she hadn't dared hope for when she had first arrived. And as Sarah settled into her new life, she began to realize that maybe, just maybe, this mix-up had been a blessing in disguise. The man she had been meant to meet wasn't Eliza's intended match, but someone else entirely, the man who had opened his home to her, who had welcomed her despite the confusion, and who had quietly changed the course of her life in ways she couldn't have imagined. As they worked side by side, something between them began to shift. It wasn't a grand romance, not yet anyway. But there was a flicker of connection that felt like the beginning of something real. As she looked at Jake, she saw not just a man who had helped her start over, but someone who had shown her the quiet power of resilience, of building a life from the ground up. And in that moment, she understood that sometimes life's greatest gifts come not from what you expect, but from the unexpected turns that bring you exactly where you're meant to be. As the weeks turned into months, Jake and Sarah found themselves settling into a new rhythm. One that was born not out of expectations or grand plans, but from the simple realities of living side by side. There was a peacefulness that had settled over the ranch, a peace that Jake hadn't realized he'd been missing until it arrived. They worked together each day, their movements synchronized in the quiet, unspoken way that comes with spending time with someone you've grown to trust. Sarah's presence in his life, once an accident, now felt like a choice one that neither of them had planned, but one that had turned out to be exactly what they both needed. The awkwardness of their initial meeting faded completely, replaced by something deeper, more tangible. What had begun as a misunderstanding, a misplaced letter, had slowly transformed into something neither of them had anticipated. They had begun to build a life together, not on the foundations of a carefully crafted plan, but from the raw, imperfect moments they had shared, the long days working the ranch, the quiet nights by the fire, and the stories that wove them closer. Together, Jake had long believed that life was about hard work, about doing what was necessary to survive. But Sarah had shown him that there was more to life than simply enduring it. She had brought warmth into his world, a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun or the heat of the fire, but was something deeper, a connection that filled the empty spaces in his heart. She had taught him to see the beauty in the small moments, to find joy in the simplest of things. It was a lesson Jake hadn't expected to learn, but one that had transformed the way he saw the world around him. With Sarah, he no longer felt like he was merely existing. He was living, truly living, and he couldn't imagine a life without her in it. What had started as an unintentional pairing had become a partnership that was founded on respect, understanding, and a shared love of the land. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the fields. Jake stood outside the cabin, watching Sarah as she worked. She had taken to caring for the garden, something he had never cared much about, but she had a way of bringing life to everything she touched. The small patch of earth behind the house, once barren and neglected, was now filled with rows of vegetables and flowers. It was a testament to Sarah's quiet determination and her ability to turn even the smallest of spaces into something beautiful. As he watched her, a feeling of contentment settled over him. He realized, without thinking, that this was exactly the life he had always wanted. It wasn't the life he had imagined with Eliza, or anyone else for that matter. It was the life he had made with Sarah, life that was imperfect, uncertain, and sometimes messy, but one that was filled with purpose and love. It wasn't long after that moment that Jake realized, with complete clarity, that he had fallen in love with Sarah. It wasn't something that had happened all at once, but something that had grown over time, as natural as the changing seasons. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic confessions, but in the quiet, everyday moments they shared, he had come to know, without a doubt, that she was the one he wanted to spend his life with. He knew it as surely as he knew the land beneath his feet, as surely as he knew the horses he cared for and the cattle that grazed in the fields. He didn't need to search for love anymore. It had found him in the most unexpected of ways, and it had grown between them like the flowers Sarah had planted in the garden. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch, Sarah turned to him, her eyes soft with something that Jake couldn't quite place. She had changed too, in the time they had spent together. The hesitant woman who had first arrived at his ranch had transformed into someone strong, confident, and sure of herself. She had found her place on the land, in his life, and in her own heart. It was in that moment, as the soft breeze rustled, the trees and the golden light of the afternoon warmed the porch, that Sarah spoke the words Jake had been waiting for. "Jake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think I've found my home here, with you." Her words, simple as they were, filled Jake's heart with an overwhelming sense of relief and happiness. He reached out, taking her hand in his, and without saying a word, he knew that the life they had built together was just the beginning. This was the future he had been waiting for, and it was better than anything he could have imagined. In the days that followed, they made their commitment to each other official, not in front of a preacher or with a grand ceremony, but in the way that felt most natural to them, quietly, simply, and with the promise of a future built on the strength of their shared life. Jake didn't need Eliza, or anyone else for that matter. He had found his partner, his equal, in Sarah. She was the one who had walked into his life unexpectedly, but who had become the very thing he had needed all along. And as they stood together, side by side, looking out over the land that had once felt so lonely to him, Jake realized that life, despite its uncertainties and surprises, had a way of leading you exactly where you were meant to be. And for him, that place was right here, with Sarah, on the land he had always loved, but had only now come to truly appreciate in its fullest sense. The cowboy had closed the door on a life he thought he wanted, only to open it to something far richer, far deeper, and more fulfilling than he could have ever imagined.